The Hanging Party, a short story by John William Tuohy. Tommy Chandler sat in the parking lot at the Valley Diner as though it were a safe haven against the impending storm. It wasn't. It was just the first place to stop, and he was early. Salesman's habit. Loosening his sedately striped silk tie and slipping out of his woolen suit coat, he got out of the car and walked the length of the lot to stretch his legs. He recalled the times he'd walked here as a boy, eager to spend the few dollars he earned each week delivering the Ansonia Evening Sentinel. It was a great local newspaper while it lasted. It gave him his start in business. He wondered if kids still delivered the paper anywhere in America. He peered through the lightly falling rain into the darkness of the diner and recalled the days before it closed at night. When he was a kid and this was a factory town, the diner was open around the clock. The place was operated by the what was their name? Greeks. Kronos. That's what it was, Kronos, something like that. Mr. Kronos had a kid who was a big deal on the high school football team, but he died or something, or was that somebody else? Anyway, then the factories left and the place cut back its hours. He heard that Kronos sold out and moved to Florida and practically gave the place to the cook, some Mexican guy, or something like that. Then he died and the place went to Dolores Carney. He knew the Carneys from the Assumption School. He heard she had a kid with Down syndrome who got married, and that Dolores married a guy from Seymour, a plumber. Turning from the diner, he took a deep breath. This was his town. This is the place they would bring him back to when it was his turn to go. This place where they still called him Tommy. Out of boredom, he carefully kicked the mud from the hand-sewn leather on his oxblood loafers and watched as a pretty girl in a waitress uniform and no raincoat leapt from a cab and dashed through the raindrops into the diner. Then, seeing the procession approach through the cold, rain-soaked streets, he straightened the nose of his silk tie around his neck, and slipped back behind the waiting warmth of the automobile's black European leather seat. Turning the ignition, he slid the car into gear and joined the procession as the last car. It was, he thought, a long procession. They always are when you die young. When you die old, there are not enough people still alive who remember you to form a decent procession. That was his theory anyway. They drove slowly through the streets. The town was lifeless. Where were the vast herds of loud and laughing children who once roamed these streets? What became of the corner markets with their crooked floors and wooden counters, bent under the weight of those enormous, ancient cash registers with the white ivory keys? Places like Seneski's with their hand-stuffed kielbasa, and Nicoletti's where the mozzarella was so fresh it dripped with warm milk. Like the children, they were gone, and with them went the identity that was, to him anyway, the things that defined this place. The mills were gone too. Closed and silent as coffins. They said the wages were too high and the unions wanted too much. The truth is, the profits were too low, and it was the bosses who wanted too much. When they left, they took everything with them, leaving behind a generation too proud to cry foul. He thought that Maria looked good, considering the circumstances. How long had it been? 24 years? He saw her stand beside the grave. He had not seen her in almost as many years as he had lived here. She was older and it showed in her face. He couldn't remember Iggy Gallagher's face anymore. It was a closed coffin. He pulled down the visor and looked into the mirror at his own face and noticed for the first time that he looked old, or at least older. Annoyed, he slapped the contraption shut. Pulling himself away from his thoughts and trying to remember what Iggy looked like, he looked around him and realized he had stopped at a light. To his left was a vacant storefront. Wasn't that where Giordano's Pizza was? What a shame. He recalled a faded snapshot he had someplace, in a box somewhere, of him, Iggy and Maria upstairs at Giordano's Pizza, where the booths had white tablecloths and silverware. Downstairs the tables were bare cold linoleum, and the forks and knives were white plastic. The pictures showed him and Iggy arm in arm, smiling broadly, proud of their new white shirts and new white ties, designed to match the new soles for their first communions. Straightening his tie again and slipping his suit coat on, he followed the others into the modest house. He paused for a second to look over the valley below, past the town that lay in near lifeless repose, and strained to see the ocean that pushed brief, light winds of salt air around his face. Holding the door for a couple he didn't know, he slowly made his way inside, finding a spot between the parlor and the dining room to stand, feeling uncomfortable and exposed. He nodded and smiled to the few who cast a look his way and discreetly pulled his shirt cuff over his watch that was too expensive for the room. It genuinely surprised him when a somber caterer piled tin trays of overcooked food onto the imitation pine table. Where were the old aunts who never learned to speak English? The ones permanently draped in black, shapeless dresses, rosaries tied to their wrists, scurrying back and forth from the kitchen with massive plates of peppers and onions and garlic salami? Where was the grappa and the tiny cups of murky espresso? He reluctantly shuffled toward the table to pick and nibble bits of microwaved food, served on styrofoam plates. Filling a paper cup with warm Coke, he retreated to his spot between the parlor and the dining room to wait for time to pass. After what seemed like an eternity, he placed his drink on top of the TV, walked across the room, and tapped a young man on the shoulder. "Michael," he said, "I'm Thomas Chandler. I'm sorry for your troubles. He was too young to die. Mr. Chandler, my dad talked about you a lot. I feel like I know you." "He talked about me?" Chandler asked quickly. "Yeah, all the time, crazy Tommy Chandler. Did you really take a cop car for a joyride?" "No," he lied. "And your mother? Meaning, did she ever speak of him?" "Oh yeah, I'll get her. I'll tell her you're leaving. She's been with the funeral guy since we got back." "No. No, don't. That's fine." He gave the young man a final long look. Like his father, he wore an unmistakably Irish face. He had his mother's dark eyes and dark hair. Tommy Chandler was elated, and it showed in his eyes and in his growing smile. He had always relegated what they had done as a horrendous mistake, but now, seeing this stunningly handsome young man, he realized that the creation of a life could never be a mistake. He slowly shook the young man's hand, and reluctantly releasing it, he made his way out of the car, loosening his tie with his first step outside. He slipped off the coat and slid behind the wheel. "Chandler," Maria called across the growing density of the fog. He turned to watch Maria stroll from the darkness of the house into the grey light of the day and float, ghost-like, across the lawn and lean on his opened car door. Clad in black, her once handsome face was ghastly pale, which illuminated the redness of her sensuous full lips when she smiled at him. She said, "Eat and run, huh?" "Yeah, you only came for the food." "Yeah," he droned with a purposeful flatness as he handed her a plastic fork. "That and to steal your plasticware. You caught me." She took the fork, held it against her ominous black dress, and rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I have to work and Ma doesn't cook anymore. Her arthritis, you know? It was just easier to hire somebody, you know?" And she turned her full attention to the car's silver roof. She stroked a few raindrops from it, and she said approvingly, "Life is good, I see." "No, not really." He smiled with his best sardonic smile, and looking over the car said, "I stole it." She returned his smile quickly, and it transformed her. For a second, only a second, the deep lines were gone from her face, and her magnificent eyes, lovely, flashed with life, and then the look disappeared as unexpectedly as it arrived, and she retreated to her detached spirit again. "It was a long ways for you to come there, Tommy." "Thank you," she said in a way that was not hers. "I didn't expect to see you." He searched for acrimony in the last words, and not finding any, he used the moment to study her still beautiful, if drained face. She looked tired. That was to be expected. But it was more than that. There was an aura about her, a dissolute grimness really, that gave off a sense of defeat that had buried her and made her older than her years. She narrowed her eyes in a way that startled and concerned him. The disapproval for what he was must have shown through on her face. Realizing he was caught, he retreated into banality. "Eliza saw it in the New Haven Register," he said, going through the trouble of calling the paper by its full name yet not explaining which Eliza he meant. "You remember Eliza?" he added, "My sister." "Yeah, sure, yeah, the little one. How is she?" "She's fine. She's in Old Saybrook. Painting. She had a show up in Hartford and—" he stopped himself. This wasn't the time. She saw he stopped himself, reluctant to use the word obituary. "She saw the thing in the paper about Iggy, so I just thought." "No, yeah sure, that's fine." She interrupted in an effort to rescue him from his obvious uneasiness. "You're always welcome here, you know that. You're like family, Tommy, you always were. Iggy would have been so proud that you was here, honest to God." He noticed she bobbed her head with every word. "He really loved you, Tommy," she whispered with what sounded to him to be an accusing icy shriek. But it wasn't. It was just his Catholic schoolboy guilt torturing him again. He decided not to answer, and for a second that felt like an eternity, silence fell over them. "It's good to see you again, Chandler," and suddenly a softness from a time long gone, warmed her words. "You too, Maria Sazo," he said, using her maiden name, the name he knew her as, all those years ago. He lifted his eyes to the morose, drenched little house and said, "He's a handsome young man, your son." "Well spoken." "Yeah, sure. He's a good boy," she whispered. "He reminds me of you sometimes." "Really?" The notion delighted him and it showed. "Why?" "Yeah, you know, some of the things he says. They just fly out of left field, you know? He tells you whatever comes into his mind. He makes you laugh." Still looking toward the house, she continued, "He's got your eyes. Did you notice?" "No," he lied again. She returned her eyes to his and he could see the question coming before she spoke the words. "Did you ever have any?" She trailed off, feeling the question was an intrusion, something she had never felt with him in the past. "Kids?" he answered. "No." He shrugged because he didn't want to discuss it and he really could not find the right way to explain himself. There wasn't enough time, settling for the wrong word. Thing, I don't know why." "Who knows why?" He smiled at her but she did not smile back. She stared at him. She decided that whatever she was looking for in him was gone or maybe it was never really there. Disregarding the uneasy silence, she decided to stare at him again for a few seconds longer to make sure she was right about what she saw. "You've changed," allowing her disappointment to seep through in her voice. The wind changed directions, as New England shoreline winds are prone to do. He wanted to leave. "Did you ever tell him?" he asked, hoping she had and hoping she had not. "About us?" she asked. He nodded, aware that his anticipation showed. "No," she said and folded her thin olive-colored arms against a sudden sea breeze. "You know, what would be the point there, Tommy? You know? It would have caused more problems than it would have solved, and Iggy was a good father to him. So, like, I don't know, you know?" The thought of it all overwhelmed her. "We were young, Tommy." She was being generous. Young Ignatius Gallagher, a cop like his father, appeared in the doorway and waved to her. "Saved," she smiled and waved back. So finally, it was over. It had ended. Together, they had reached a separate peace. That incident in their young lives had forever fragmented time and he learned, it's difficult to make sense of the world when time is broken. "Well," he said but couldn't think of another word to say so he said nothing. She wrapped her arms across her petite body, and he, no longer used to the winter ocean chill, leaned back into the warmth of the car's leather seats. "Do you need anything?" he asked, putting the key in the ignition. "Anything at all?" Suddenly, she seemed distant. "No. No, Iggy had his pension from the department. I'm still working. There's no insurance because of what he did to himself but we're okay." She smiled dismissively. "Take care, Tommy. If you ever need anything, Maria." She slowly turned and walked away in mid-sentence. "I know," she said over her shoulder, "I can count on you." The words stung him one by one. She turned slightly and waved a spiritless wave, and walked slowly back to the house. He pulled off his tie, tossed it on the floor, and drove away, back downtown,